Subscribe and download over 1 million code snippet including this tutorial from codegive.com, link in the description below. In this tutorial, we will explore how to use AWS API Gateway with Lambda authorizers implemented in Python. API Gateway Lambda authorizers help you control access to your APIs by enabling you to authorize API requests using custom logic implemented as AWS Lambda functions. Before you begin, ensure you have the following. First, we need to create a Lambda function that will handle the authorization logic. In this example, we'll create a simple Python function. Use the AWS CLI or the AWS Management Console to create and deploy the Lambda function. Now, let's create an API gateway with a resource and method that we want to protect using the Lambda authorizer. In the AWS Management Console, navigate to the API Gateway service. Once the authorizer is created, attach it to your API Gateway method. Now, you can test your API by making requests with appropriate authorization tokens. You should receive a successful response if the token is authorized, and a denial response otherwise. In this tutorial, you learned how to implement AWS API Gateway Lambda authorizers using Python. Lambda authorizers provide a flexible and powerful way to control access to your APIs based on custom logic implemented in Lambda functions. With this knowledge, you can now implement secure access controls for your AWS APIs. ChatGPT. Title: Building an AWS API Gateway Lambda authorizer with Python, a step-by-step tutorial. Introduction. AWS API Gateway Lambda authorizers provide a powerful mechanism for controlling access to your API endpoints. In this tutorial, we will walk through the process of setting up an API gateway with a Lambda authorizer using Python. This will allow you to authenticate and authorize requests before they reach your backend services. Prerequisites. Step 1. Create a Lambda function for authorization. Start by creating a Lambda function that will handle the authorization logic. Step 2. Deploy the Lambda function. Use the AWS CLI to create and deploy the Lambda function. Step 3. Create an API gateway. Now, let's create an API gateway and link it to the Lambda authorizer function. Retrieve the API ID from the output, and replace your API ID in the following command. Step 4. Create a resource and method. Create a resource and method in the API gateway. Step 5. Deploy the API. Deploy the API to make it accessible. Step 6. Test the authorization. Make a request to your API, including the authorization header with a valid or invalid token. In this tutorial, we will walk through the process of creating a serverless authentication system using AWS API Gateway and Lambda authorizer with Python. Lambda authorizer is a feature in API Gateway that allows you to use AWS Lambda functions to control access to your API. Before we begin, make sure you have the following prerequisites. AWS account. Ensure that you have an AWS account and necessary permissions to create API Gateway, Lambda functions, and IAM roles. AWS CLI. Install the AWS command line interface to manage AWS resources from the command line. Python. Make sure you have Python installed on your local machine for writing Lambda functions. First, let's create a Lambda function that will act as our authorizer. This function will receive the authorization token from the API gateway and return a policy that defines whether the request is allowed or denied. Make sure to replace your secret token with your actual authentication logic. Use the AWS CLI to create and deploy the Lambda function. Navigate to the directory containing authorizer_function.py and run the following commands. Replace your account ID and your execution role with your AWS account ID and the IAM role ARN that Lambda will assume. Now, let's create an API gateway with a secured endpoint. Open the AWS Management Console and navigate to API Gateway. Click on Create API. Choose the HTTP API option and click Build under Configure Routes. Add a resource and a method, example get, to the API. Under the integration settings, set the Lambda function integration to the Lambda function created earlier. Click on authorizers and create a new authorizer. Select the Lambda function and set the token source to authorization. Deploy the API to a stage. You can now test your API by making a request with the authorization token. Replace your API gateway URL with the actual URL of your API gateway and your resource with the resource you created. The Lambda authorizer will validate the token and either allow or deny access based on your defined logic. Congratulations! You have successfully implemented an AWS API gateway with Lambda authorizer using Python. Feel free to enhance the authentication logic and customize the authorizer function according to your specific requirements. ChatGPT